everybody, here we are on chapter 6. We're going to be talking a lot about the blood during this chapter. We just finished the cardiovascular system, so we understand how blood's moved around the body. So now we have to understand the actual pieces of the blood. So the main key factors in this chapter are going to be blood, an overview. We'll talk a little bit about red blood cells and how they move oxygen. Then we'll talk about white blood cells and how they defend against disease. Platelets and blood clotting, so how do we keep from leaking, then blood typing and transfusions, and then in general, just how do we maintain homeostasis in the blood. So let's just start with what the functions of blood are. Primarily, it's used for transportation, so things like oxygen, nutrients, wastes, carbon dioxide, your hormones. Many systems of the body take advantage of the bloodstream so that's how they deliver their different things that they do. Defense is the next key thing that it does. So it defends against invasion by pathogens. And then regulatory functions, so like maintaining your body temperature, water and salt balance, and the pH. Blood itself is a fluid connective tissue, which means that it has blood cells, and then those cells are separated by a matrix. And in this case, that matrix is a liquid. The formed elements come in 3 different types. They're produced in your red bone marrow. We have red blood cells, or your erythrocytes. Erythro refers to being red, cyte is cell. Your white blood cells, leukocytes, leuko means white, cyte means cell. And your platelets, which are your thrombocytes. The plasma itself is primarily water, although it does contain about 9% of salts, which are things like ions, organic molecules. Plasma proteins tend to be the most abundant of those organic molecules. So back when we were talking about diffusion and osmosis, remember, if we wanted to be maintaining that same level, an isotonic solution, we were trying to keep it at about 9%. Well, that's because it's 91% water, 9% other stuff. There are 3 main types of plasma proteins. Albumin's the most common one. It's really important for osmotic pressure and transport. There are also globulins, which are important in transport, and then fibrinogen, which is part of how we form our blood clots. Of the formed elements, they come in multiple different types. There's a stem cells that live inside that red bone marrow. So you can see we've got a picture of a bone with a stem cell. These stem cells differentiate. They can turn into erythroblasts, which eventually make the red blood cells. They can turn into the megakaryoblast, which are what form the platelets. And then we have the stem cells that are for the white blood cells, the lymphoblasts, which make lymphocytes, monoblasts, which make monocytes, and myeloblasts, which make your neutrophils, eosinophils, and your basophils. We'll talk later about how these actually function in the bloodstream, but you can see those 3 different types that we talked about before. The red blood cells, which deal with transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, your platelets, which are part of your blood clotting factors, and then your white blood cells, which are part of your immune defense. Let's start by just looking at your red blood cells. They lack a nucleus and have a few organelles. They have a biconcave shape. So if you look at this image down here, you'll notice you can see how it dips in, and that's just a little face. Those aren't actually there on the blood cell. There's hardly any organelles in there. They're pretty tiny, but this biconcave shape increases surface area because really their main goal is to transport oxygen. Each red blood cell contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules that bind 3 molecules of oxygen each. So think about that, 280 million molecules, each one binding 3 molecules of oxygen inside one single red blood cell, which we have a lot of in our body. So we can carry quite a bit of oxygen. You will also notice that this structure is really important for them moving through the capillaries. You can see that nice round structure allows them to slip through the capillaries. Some athletes will dope on a particular hormone, which increases, it's called erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. And you get a lot more red blood cells, which makes them an incredible athlete because you can carry a lot of oxygen. However, you can look in that capillary and notice they would have a really hard time sliding through those capillary walls if you had a lot more red blood cells present. So you can imagine that getting gummed up, and people who are doping on that can often die. Here you can see a picture of your hemoglobin molecule that's residing inside those red blood cells. The other thing that we have to transport in the bloodstream is carbon dioxide. That's a byproduct of cellular respiration. 68% of it is stored as bicarbonate. It just dissolves into the bloodstream. 25% of it will go into the red blood cells, and 7% of it is just basically carbon dioxide in the plasma. But as you can see, most of it, when you dissolve carbon dioxide into water, it turns into carbonic acid, which then rearranges itself until you get this bicarbonate ion. This is actually what we do in soda when we dissolve carbon dioxide into soda. When that blood gets to your lungs and it gets to the alveoli, the pressure is released and it will actually bubble out of the bloodstream into the lungs. So that's part of why I have this picture here. The red blood cells are produced in your bone marrow. They last about 120 days, and the hormone that helps produce this is erythropoietin. That's what I was talking about with the athletes. It's secreted by the kidney cells, and it moves to the red marrow. And primarily what happens is if your blood oxygen levels are too low, then your kidneys recognize that, secrete erythropoietin. That makes it to the red marrow through the bloodstream, and it causes you to produce more red blood cells. A good example of this is when I went to the mountains to do research. The first couple of weeks, I was really winded because there was less oxygen up there. By the end of my research stay, I had produced enough extra red blood cells that I wasn't winded at that high altitude anymore. Once your cells are finished at the end of their 120 days, the liver and the spleen will break them back down again and reuse those raw materials. Here you could see this as a flow chart. Low oxygen levels in the blood stimulates the kidney to produce erythropoietin. That makes it to the red marrow of the bone cells, which causes additional red blood cells to be produced, returning your oxygen levels back up to normal. So this is that blood doping that we were talking about. This is any method of increasing the number of red blood cells to increase athletic performance. It gives a much more efficient delivery of oxygen and makes you a lot less tired. However, if you do dope with that erythropoietin, it can cause death. Now, some athletes don't dope this way. What they do is they just go up to the Rocky Mountains and they work out in these really high altitudes, which is a much safer way of doing it and totally legal, unlike with injecting erythropoietin. Some disorders that can happen with the red blood cells include anemia. Actually, anemia is really common among teenage girls, although teenage boys can get it, but just basic anemia is pretty common in girls between 16 and 22. What happens is the iron levels go too low, and when the iron levels get too low, you can't make enough hemoglobin. So even though you have red blood cells, even though you're breathing oxygen, you don't have enough hemoglobin to carry that oxygen at the levels you normally would. It makes you feel very, very run down and tired. The fix to this is getting more iron into the body. Sickle cell anemia is something we talked about in biology class. It's where there's a mutation in the production of the hemoglobin molecule, and it causes this sickling of the red blood cells, which causes clotting in the bloodstream, which is what this image is showing. There's also something called hemolytic disease of the newborn. It's where the blood types of the mother and the newborn baby are incompatible, and the mother's immune system starts to attack the baby. It's very life-threatening to both mother and baby, and it can cause blood cells to both rupture and clot in the baby right around birth. We have medications to treat it. We just have to know if it's there. So in conclusion, we basically just talked about what blood is and the three key parts to it: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and then the other half of that is your plasma. And then we talked a little bit about the red blood cells and how they transport oxygen.